American pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. They'd just captured one of Japan's most feared bombers, the Mitsubishi G4M, and when they looked inside, they found something that made absolutely no sense. The fuel tanks had zero armor protection, none. And this wasn't some design oversight. This was intentional, but why would Japan deliberately send their pilots into combat in what was basically a flying coffin? The Betty bomber, as the Allies called it, shot down more American planes than almost any other Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. It could fly further than any bomber the Americans had. It packed serious firepower. On paper, it should have been the perfect war machine. But there was one massive problem that every single pilot who flew it knew about. One design choice that turned these aircraft into death traps. And when American engineers finally got their hands on one in 1943 and tore it apart piece by piece, what they discovered revealed something dark about how Japan was fighting this war. Something that explained why so many Japanese airmen never made it home. Let me take you back to June 1943, the Solomon Islands. American forces had just secured a small airfield, and intelligence reports were coming in about a damaged Japanese bomber that had crash-landed nearby. This wasn't just any bomber, this was a Betty, the aircraft that had been terrorizing Allied positions across the Pacific for nearly 2 years. Captain James Mitchell was part of the recovery team sent to examine the wreckage. He'd been a mechanical engineer before the war, worked for Boeing, knew aircraft inside and out. When he first approached the downed Betty, he expected to find sophisticated Japanese engineering, maybe some secret technology that explained why these bombers were so effective. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Betty was surprisingly intact despite the crash landing. The fuselage had buckled in places, one wing was torn up pretty bad, but the main body of the aircraft was accessible. Mitchell and his team spent the first few hours just documenting everything, taking photographs, making sketches, measuring dimensions. Then they started looking at the internal systems, the fuel system, and that's when things got weird. "Where's the armor?" Mitchell asked his assistant, a young lieutenant named Patterson, who'd been trained in aircraft recognition. Patterson looked confused. "What do you mean, sir?" "The fuel tank protection, the armor plating, where is it?" They searched the entire fuel system. Main tanks, auxiliary tanks, fuel lines running through the wings and fuselage. Nothing. No armor, no self-sealing mechanisms like American aircraft had. Not even basic protective coating. Mitchell couldn't wrap his head around it. He'd seen American bombers, British bombers, even some captured German aircraft. Every single one had some form of fuel tank protection. It was basic aviation safety, especially for combat aircraft. One tracer round into an unprotected fuel tank and the whole plane would go up like a Roman candle. But the Betty had nothing. At first, Mitchell thought maybe the armor had been removed, maybe salvaged by Japanese forces before they abandoned the area. But the more they examined the aircraft, the more obvious it became. This wasn't missing armor. This was a deliberate design choice. The Betty was built to fly without protection. To understand why Japan made this seemingly insane decision, we need to go back to 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy first put out requirements for a new twin-engine bomber. Japan was already at war with China, and they needed an aircraft that could reach targets deep into Chinese territory from bases on the coast. The requirements were specific. The bomber needed a range of at least 2,300 miles. It needed to carry a substantial bomb load, at least 1,760 pounds. It needed to be fast enough to outrun enemy fighters, and it needed to be able to defend itself with multiple gun positions. Here's the problem, though. These requirements were basically impossible to meet with 1930s technology, at least not all at once. Think about it like this. You want an aircraft that can fly really far, which means it needs lots of fuel, which means weight. You want it to carry lots of bombs, which means more weight. You want it to be fast, which means powerful engines, which means more weight. You want defensive guns and crew to operate them, which again means more weight. Every aircraft designer in the world understood this fundamental truth. Everything is a trade-off. Want more range? You sacrifice armor or weapons. Want more armor? You sacrifice range or speed. Want more weapons? You sacrifice everything else. But the Japanese Navy didn't want to sacrifice anything. They wanted it all. The project was given to Mitsubishi, one of Japan's leading aircraft manufacturers. The lead designer was a man named Kiro Honjo, and he was given what seemed like an impossible task. Build a bomber that meets all these requirements and do it fast, because Japan needed these aircraft yesterday. Honjo and his team worked around the clock. They ran calculations, built models, tested different configurations, and they kept running into the same wall: weight. The aircraft was always too heavy. They'd add fuel capacity, and the plane couldn't take off. They'd add armor, and the range dropped to useless levels. They'd strengthen the airframe, and the whole thing became too slow. Something had to give. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because the decision of what to sacrifice tells you everything about Japanese military philosophy during World War II. Honjo's team made a choice. They decided to prioritize range and speed above everything else. And I mean everything. Not only did they skip armor protection for the fuel tanks, they also used the lightest possible materials for the entire airframe. The skin of the aircraft was so thin you could practically punch through it with your fist. The structural supports were minimized to save every possible ounce of weight. They even designed the fuel tanks to be part of the wing structure itself. The wings were basically just giant fuel containers with some metal wrapped around them. This saved weight because they didn't need separate tank structures, but it also meant that any damage to the wings could rupture the fuel system. The result was an aircraft that could fly an incredible distance and reach speeds up to 270 miles per hour. For comparison, that was faster than some fighters at the time. The Betty could carry its bomb load further than any other bomber in any air force in the world. But it was also incredibly fragile. American pilots who encountered Bettys in combat started calling them flying lighters because of how easily they caught fire. One good burst from a .50 caliber machine gun and the whole thing would erupt in flames. Japanese pilots had their own nickname for them, Hamaki, which means cigar, because that's what they looked like when they were burning, which happened a lot. Now you might be thinking, okay, so the Japanese made a calculated trade-off. They chose range over protection. That's not crazy, right? Lots of military decisions involve trade-offs. But here's what makes this different. The Japanese knew almost immediately that this was a fatal flaw. They knew because their pilots kept dying. The Betty entered service in 1941, just in time for the attack on Pearl Harbor. And at first, it seemed to justify its design. The long range meant Japanese bombers could strike targets that seemed impossibly far away. In the early days of the war, when Japan was on the offensive and American forces were reeling, the Betty's ability to show up anywhere, anytime, was terrifying. But as soon as American fighters started getting organized, the problems became obvious. Let me tell you about a mission that happened on April 18, 1943. This was the mission where Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was killed. Yamamoto was flying in a Betty bomber as part of a 2-aircraft transport flight to visit troops in the Solomon Islands. American intelligence had intercepted the flight plan, and P-38 Lightning fighters were sent to intercept. The P-38s caught up with the Bettys exactly as planned. The American pilots, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier, opened fire. One Betty immediately started trailing smoke. According to Lanphier's account, he fired a short burst into the bomber's left engine and wing root. Just a few seconds of fire. The Betty exploded. Not caught fire, not started smoking, exploded mid-air. Yamamoto's aircraft disintegrated so fast that witnesses said it looked like it had been hit by anti-aircraft fire, not machine guns. The second Betty tried to make an emergency landing but crashed and burned on impact. Everyone aboard both aircraft died. This wasn't unusual. This was normal for Betty. Operations. Japanese records show that Betty bomber units had some of the highest casualty rates in the entire imperial military. Some squadrons lost more than 70% of their aircraft in the first year of combat operations. Pilots called being assigned to a Betty unit a death sentence, and the Japanese High Command knew this. They had the reports, they had the casualty figures, they knew their crews were dying at unsustainable rates, so why didn't they fix it? This is where we get into the really dark part of the story. The part that Captain Mitchell and his team started to understand as they examined that captured Betty in 1943. The part that reveals something horrifying about how Japan was prosecuting the war. The Japanese military in World War II operated on a fundamentally different philosophy than Western militaries. And I'm not just talking about tactics or strategy. I'm talking about how they valued human life, specifically the lives of their own soldiers. In Western military thinking, there's always been this idea that while soldiers might have to die in combat, you have an obligation to give them the best chance of survival you can. You train them, you equip them properly. You don't send them on suicide missions unless there's absolutely no other choice, and the objective is critical. The Japanese military had a different view. They believed that the individual soldier's life was less important than the mission, and less important than demonstrating spiritual strength and loyalty to the emperor. This wasn't just propaganda, though there was plenty of that. This was doctrine. This was how officers were trained to think. Individual survival was seen as less important than achieving the objective, and being willing to die was considered the highest form of service. You can see this in the kamikazes, obviously, literally turning pilots into guided missiles. But the Betty bomber represents something even more insidious, because at least kamikaze pilots knew what they were signing up for. They volunteered for suicide missions. Betty pilots were just trying to do their jobs, flying what they thought was a regular bomber, except their own military had deliberately built them an aircraft that had a massive, known, documented flaw that killed them at extraordinary rates, and the military chose not to fix it because fixing it would reduce the aircraft's range, and range was considered more important than crew survival. When Mitchell's team discovered this, when they realized the lack of armor wasn't an oversight but a choice, it changed how they thought about the enemy they were fighting. This wasn't just a different culture. This was a military that was willing to sacrifice its own people in ways that seemed almost incomprehensible. Mitchell wrote in his report, "The Japanese have built an aircraft that prioritizes the machine's capabilities over the operator's life. This is not simply poor engineering. This is a reflection of a military doctrine that views its personnel as expendable resources rather than trained professionals worth protecting." Let me get specific about what Mitchell's team found when they really got into the technical details of that captured Betty, because the lack of fuel tank armor was just the beginning. The more they examined the aircraft, the more they found decisions that seemed to prioritize range and weight savings over crew safety. The fuselage skin, as I mentioned, was incredibly thin. American bombers like the B-17 had skin that was 0.064 inches thick in many places. The Betty's skin was 0.031 inches in most places, half as thick. You could literally see it flex when you pushed on it. This saved weight, sure. It also meant that even small arms fire, the kind of guns that infantry carried, could penetrate the fuselage. There are documented cases of Bettys being badly damaged by soldiers on the ground with rifles. Regular rifles, not anti-aircraft guns, rifles. The internal structure was similarly minimal. The ribs and stringers that gave the aircraft its shape and strength were spaced further apart than in American designs, and they were made from thinner material. Again, this saved weight. It also meant the aircraft couldn't take much damage before structural failure. Mitchell found that the Betty had a tendency to break up in flight if it took even moderate damage to the wing roots or tail section. The structure just wasn't strong enough to hold together under stress. American aircraft could often fly home with huge chunks missing. Bettys would disintegrate, but the fuel system was the real nightmare. Let me explain how it worked, because it's worse than just no armor. The Betty had 4 main fuel tanks built into the wings, 2 on each side. These tanks held about 1,180 gallons of fuel in total. The tanks were made of thin aluminum and were actually integrated into the wing structure, meaning the wing skin itself formed part of the tank walls. Fuel lines ran from these tanks through the fuselage to the engines. These lines were completely exposed. They weren't armored, they weren't protected, they ran right through the crew compartment in some places. If a bullet hit one of these lines, fuel would spray everywhere inside the aircraft. American bombers had self-sealing fuel tanks. These used a layered design where the tank was lined with rubber that would swell and seal if punctured. It wasn't perfect, but it significantly reduced fire risk. The Japanese knew about this technology. They'd seen it in captured American aircraft. They chose not to use it because it added weight. The Betty also had a carbon dioxide fire suppression system, but Mitchell's team found it was basically useless. It was underpowered and couldn't generate enough pressure to actually suppress a major fuel fire. It was more of a psychological comfort for the crew than actual protection. And here's maybe the most damning detail. The crew had no way to dump fuel in an emergency. American bombers could jettison fuel if they needed to reduce weight for an emergency landing or if they were on fire. The Betty couldn't. Once fuel was in those tanks, it was there until it was burned in the engines or the aircraft exploded. Mitchell calculated that a single incendiary round, the kind that American fighters carried lots of, had about an 80% chance of causing a catastrophic fire if it hit the wing area. Compare that to about 15% for an American bomber with protected tanks. The Betty was more than 5 times as likely to burn. What makes this even more tragic is that we have testimonies from Japanese pilots who survived Betty operations, and they all tell the same story. They knew the aircraft was a death trap. They just had no choice but to fly it. One pilot, whose account was translated after the war, wrote about his first mission in a Betty. He described how during the pre-flight briefing, the squadron commander gave them what he called the speech. Every new Betty pilot got this speech. The commander told them that the aircraft was fast and had excellent range. It could reach targets other bombers couldn't. It was a privilege to fly such an advanced machine. Then, almost as an afterthought, the commander mentioned that the fuel tanks were unprotected. He said this was to save weight for more fuel and bombs. He said that if they were hit in the wings, they probably wouldn't make it back. He said this as if it was just a minor detail, like mentioning that the cockpit might get cold at high altitude. The pilot wrote, "I remember thinking, why are you telling us this? Why build a plane that you know will kill us if we're hit? But I didn't say anything. None of us did. You didn't question orders." Another account comes from a Betty crew member who was shot down and captured by Australian forces in 1943. He told his interrogators about a mission where his squadron of 9 Bettys was intercepted by American P-38s. 8 of the 9 bombers were destroyed. His aircraft was the only one to make it back, and it was so shot up that it crashed on landing. He was the only survivor from his crew. He said the entire mission, from the moment they spotted the American fighters to the moment he woke up in the hospital, lasted maybe 20 minutes. In that time, his squadron lost 8 aircraft and more than 70 men. He said the Americans didn't have to be particularly good shots. They just had to hit the wings. 1 or 2 hits and the Betty would light up. When the interrogators asked him why Japan kept using these aircraft despite the losses, he said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. "We asked the same question. The officers said it was our duty to accept the Emperor's gift of the aircraft and use it to destroy the enemy. Our survival was secondary to the mission. This wasn't one crazy officer. This was systematic. This was doctrine. Let's talk about the actual statistics because numbers don't lie. The loss rates for Betty bombers were staggering compared to any other aircraft in the war. During the early Pacific campaigns, 1941 to 1943, Betty bomber units had an average operational loss rate of about 35% per month. Let me put that in perspective. That means if you had a squadron of 12 aircraft on January 1st, by February 1st, you'd have lost 4 of them on average. By March 1st, another 3 or 4. Within 6 months, your entire original squadron would be gone. Compare that to American B-17 bombers flying missions over Europe, which faced some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition of the war. B-17 loss rates averaged around 5% per mission during the worst periods. The Betty was losing 7 times as many aircraft as a proportion of sorties flown. Japanese records show that between 1941 and 1945, approximately 2,400 Betty bombers were built. By war's end, fewer than 50 were still operational. Most had been destroyed in combat. That's a loss rate of over 97%. For comparison, the United States built about 12,700 B-17s. At war's end, thousands were still in service. Even accounting for B-17s lost in combat, the survival rate was orders of magnitude better. The human cost was even worse. Each Betty had a crew of 7: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 3 gunners. With 2,400 aircraft built and most destroyed in combat, that's potentially 16,800 crew members killed. And that's just the initial crew. Many aircraft were repaired and flew again with new crews who were also killed when those aircraft were shot down again. Japanese military records are incomplete, but historians estimate that Betty bomber units suffered approximately 15,000 fatalities during the war. That's 15,000 trained aircrew, people who took months or years to train, just gone. And for what? The Betty's operational success rate wasn't significantly better than other bombers. It just had longer range. When American intelligence finally put all this together, when they understood that Japan had deliberately built an aircraft with known fatal flaws, it changed how they fought the war in the Pacific. American fighter pilots were briefed specifically on the Betty's vulnerabilities. They were told to target the wings, specifically the area where the fuel tanks were located. They were told that even if they couldn't get a good firing angle on the cockpit or engines, hits on the wings would likely result in a kill. This became standard practice. When American fighters encountered Bettys, they didn't waste ammunition on the fuselage or try for difficult engine shots. They went straight for the wings, quick bursts into the wing roots, then break off and watch the bomber burn. It was almost sporting in a grim way. The Betty was such an easy kill that American pilots called them turkeys or flying Zippos. Some pilots considered a Betty kill barely worth reporting because it was so easy. The Japanese knew this too. They knew American pilots were specifically targeting the Betty's weak points. They knew their bombers were being systematically slaughtered, and they kept building more Bettys. They kept sending up crews in these death traps. There were attempts to improve the design. Later models of the Betty had some modifications. They added rubber coating to some fuel lines. They improved the carbon dioxide system slightly. They added some additional armor around the cockpit. But they never fixed the fundamental problem. They never added proper fuel tank protection because that would have required a major redesign and would have reduced the aircraft's range. And to the Japanese high command, range was more important than crew survival. This decision had strategic consequences beyond just the loss of aircraft and crews. The Japanese were facing a pilot shortage by 1943. They couldn't train new pilots fast enough to replace the ones dying in Bettys and other aircraft. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs were churning out thousands of new aviators every month. By continuing to use an aircraft with such high loss rates, Japan was essentially bleeding out its most experienced pilots. Betty units didn't just have high casualties, they had high casualties among their best people. Experienced pilots who might have trained the next generation or led successful missions were instead getting shot down in aircraft that were fundamentally unsafe. Now we come to the moment that really drove home the tragedy of the Betty bomber. The moment when even the Japanese high command couldn't ignore what they'd created. April 7th, 1945. The war was clearly lost for Japan at this point. American forces were preparing to invade Okinawa, just a few hundred miles from the Japanese mainland. The Japanese Navy had already lost most of its major warships. They were desperate. In this desperate situation, they launched Operation Tengo, which was basically a suicide mission. The battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was sent to Okinawa with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan was for Yamato to beach itself and use its massive guns as shore artillery until it was destroyed. To protect Yamato on this suicide run, the Japanese sent virtually every aircraft they had available. This included a large formation of Betty bombers tasked with attacking American carriers to keep their aircraft away from Yamato. The Bettys never even got close to the American fleet. They were intercepted by carrier-based fighters about 200 miles from Okinawa. The American pilots reported that the engagement was one of the most one-sided battles they'd ever experienced. The Bettys, loaded with bombs and fuel for the long mission, were sitting ducks. Out of 18 Bettys in the formation, 16 were shot down in about 15 minutes. The two that escaped were badly damaged and crashed attempting to land at their home bases. Every crew was lost. The American fighters reported no losses, not even significant damage. This mission accomplished nothing. The Bettys didn't get close enough to drop their bombs. They didn't draw any American fighters away from Yamato, which was found and sunk by carrier aircraft anyway. They just died. All those crews, all those trained pilots and navigators and gunners just killed for nothing in aircraft that were fundamentally designed to get them killed. When reports of this disaster reached Tokyo, even some of the most hardline officers started asking questions. How did we get here? How did we end up sending our people to their deaths in aircraft we knew were death traps? But by then, it was too late. The Betty had been in service for almost 4 years. Thousands of men had already died in them. The design philosophy that created the Betty, the doctrine that valued mission completion over crew survival, had permeated every level of Japanese military planning. Captain Mitchell, sitting in that examination room back in 1943, looking at the unprotected fuel tanks of that captured Betty, had predicted all of this. He wrote in his report that Japan's willingness to sacrifice its pilots for minor tactical advantages would ultimately cost them the war. He was right. So why did Japan build the Betty bomber with unprotected fuel tanks? Why did they keep using it even when the casualties became unsustainable? The answer isn't simple. It's not just one thing. It's a combination of factors that reveal something deep about how Japan fought World War II. First, there was genuine strategic logic. Japan needed long-range bombers. They were fighting across an enormous area of the Pacific. Range was critical. And in the late 1930s, when the Betty was designed, they made what seemed like a reasonable trade-off: sacrifice protection for range and speed. But the reasonable trade-off became an unreasonable sacrifice when they refused to adapt as the war progressed. By 1942, it was clear the Betty's lack of protection was causing catastrophic losses. Other nations would have redesigned the aircraft or retired it in favor of something better. Japan kept building them. This is where the cultural and philosophical factors come in. The Japanese military had convinced itself that spiritual strength and warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They believed that a pilot's willingness to die, his fighting spirit, was more important than armor or safety features. This wasn't just ignorance or stupidity. This was a deliberate philosophy. The samurai tradition, Bushido, the idea of death before dishonor, all of these cultural factors combined to create a military that saw crew safety as secondary to mission capability. And there was also simple institutional inertia. By 1943, Japan had built production lines for the Betty. They had training programs for Betty crews. They had tactics and strategies built around the Betty's capabilities. Changing to a different aircraft would have meant disrupting all of that, and Japan didn't have the industrial capacity to easily retool. So they kept building Bettys, kept sending crews out in them, kept losing men at horrific rates. And the tragedy is that many of those men knew exactly what they were flying into. They knew the risks. They just had no choice. The Betty bomber story isn't just about one aircraft with a design flaw. It's a window into how Japan fought World War II. It shows how a military can become so committed to a particular doctrine that it sacrifices its own people unnecessarily. It shows how cultural factors can override practical military logic. And it shows the human cost when leadership values abstract principles over concrete reality. Those American pilots examining that captured Betty in 1943 came away with a new understanding of their enemy. Not respect exactly, but a kind of horrified comprehension. They understood that they were fighting an adversary who was willing to accept losses that seemed incomprehensible, an adversary who would send men to their deaths in aircraft that were fundamentally unsafe, not through ignorance or accident, but as a deliberate choice. And that understanding shaped how the rest of the Pacific War was fought. American forces knew they faced an enemy who wouldn't surrender easily, who would fight with fanatical determination, who valued death over defeat. The Betty bomber, with its unprotected fuel tanks and sky-high casualty rates, was proof of that philosophy in action. Thousands of Japanese airmen died in Bettys. Most of them were young men in their 20s with families waiting for them at home. They weren't fanatics. They were just doing their jobs, following orders, serving their country the only way they knew how. And their own military put them in aircraft that killed them at rates that no other nation would have tolerated. That's the real answer to why the Betty had unprotected fuel tanks. Not because Japan couldn't build better aircraft, not because they didn't understand aviation safety, but because, in their military philosophy, the lives of those crews were acceptable losses in pursuit of range and speed. And that's a tragedy that echoes far beyond just one aircraft or one war. If you want to hear more stories like this about the Pacific War, hit that subscribe button.